TitleMatchNetwork.com.
At what point did you start to get the book and use some of your ideas on TV?
Oh, well, that wasn't until after Jerry Jarrett and I had basically gone into business for ourselves, and that came about in, I think, 1977. Jerry was, as I said, once again working for Nick Gulas and Roy Welch, and he was booking the Memphis there. The Tennessee territory was divided into sort of two ends. There was the Memphis end and the Birmingham end, and there were enough wrestlers in this area that you could book two cities every night and have a full crew at each one of the cities. And the Memphis end consisted of Memphis and Jackson, and Jackson, Tennessee, Memphis, Tennessee, Jonesboro, Arkansas, Tupelo, Mississippi, and Evansville, Indiana. And the Birmingham end had Birmingham and Huntsville and Nashville and Bowling Green, and on the Memphis end also had Louisville. And so Jerry was booking the Memphis end, and Nick was booking the Birmingham end. And the Memphis end, where Jerry was wrestling, and Jackie Fargo and Tojo and myself and Jim White, was like doing record business. We were drawing really big crowds, selling out week in and week out in almost all of the cities. And Birmingham was really not doing very well. And one of the reasons Birmingham wasn't doing very well is because Nick Gulas had a son named George who had become about 20 or 22 years old and decided that he wanted to be a wrestler. And George was not very gifted athletically, even had a little bit of a speech impediment and zero charisma, and was not very well liked simply because he was the boss's son. And Nick decided that if his son George, which was his only child, if his son George wanted to be a wrestler, damn it, he was going to be a wrestler. He didn't care what anybody thought. He didn't care what the other wrestlers wanted. He didn't care what the fans wanted. So Nick took his son George and pushed him into the limelight and into the main events and all of the towns on the Birmingham end. And the people just thought that sucked, and they resented him. They knew he was only there because he was the boss's son, and they just quit coming. They just quit coming in droves. And so Nick is sitting there looking at his end doing terrible, and the Memphis end selling out, and George is looking at that also, and George is going out wrestling in front of nobody over in Birmingham, while Memphis, we had 11,500 people at the Coliseum. So George went to Nick and said, "Dad, I want to wrestle in Memphis." Right. And so then Nick went to Jerry Jarrett and said, "Jerry, I want you to book my boy over in Memphis." And Jerry said, "No, Nick, I'm not going to book George in Memphis." He said, "We're doing great. We're selling out. And I'm not going to change things." And, of course, George was Nick's son, and Nick said, "Hey, boy, this is my territory, and I say you're going to book George in Memphis." And apparently, and I didn't even know all this was going on, Jerry had been paying into Nick a certain amount of money every week or every month to buy part of the territory, to become a part owner of the territory. And so finally, over George, it became this big stalemate, this big standoff. And Nick said, "You are going to book George in Memphis." And Jerry said, "I'm not." And Nick said, "I own this territory, and you are." And Jerry said, "Look, I own part of this territory too, and I'm not." And Nick said, "Boy, you don't own nothing." He said, "You haven't been buying nothing." And so Jerry said, "What are you talking about?" And he said, "I own all of this territory, and what I say goes." So somehow Jerry checking, sure enough, apparently what he was buying, Nick was taking money, but Jerry was not getting any stock or any percentage of the territory or anything like that. So Jerry went to Nick, and he basically quit. He said, I'm going to go in business on my own." And Nick said, "Go ahead, boy. You won't last 2 days." And so that's when Jerry came to me. Of course, I was like the top heel in the Memphis end. And he came to me and he said, "Now, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going into business for myself. I'm not going to be with Nick. I'm not going to have the good TV on Channel 13, not going to be able to wrestle at the Mid-South Coliseum. We're going to have to move somewhere else. And he said, I'm not going to be able to pay you what Nick, I'm sure, is going to offer you. But what I will do, if you will come with me, is I will cut you in on a percentage of the new territory. You'll get paid out of the profits. You'll make money if we make money. And he said, I feel certain we will. And that was my first introduction to like a free agency thing. That was my first involvement in seeing, two promoters bidding for one piece of talent, which now, of course, everybody knows goes on all the time. And it was a really unique situation and a hard decision because Nick did come to me and offer me more money and a sure thing if I stayed with him. But I may have said it was a hard decision. It really wasn't a hard decision. It was a decision to make, but I knew what was going to happen. If anybody that stayed with Nick, George Gulas was going to be shoved down everybody's throat, and it was going to kill the territory. And so I made my move and went with Jerry Jarrett. I was living in Memphis at the time, and I went over to I talked with Jerry, and he told me where to go and who to talk to. And I'll never forget, I went in by myself, walked into Channel 5. Of course, the main wrestling show was on Channel 13. And I went into Channel 5 one day and asked to speak to the program director. I walked into Channel 5 just right off the street, asked to speak to the program director. It was a guy named Phil Slavic. And took me to his office, and I introduced myself. And, of course, he knew who I was because at the time, the wrestling program on Channel 13 was the highest-rated television show in all of Memphis. We beat out we had higher ratings than the primetime shows that were on in the evenings, the network shows. And so I said, I'm here to offer you guys a wrestling show. Myself and just about all of the main wrestling stars that you see on Channel 13 would like to come and wrestle here on Channel 5. And so Phil went, whoa, wait a minute, let me go get the general manager. And so he went and got the manager of Channel 5, and I basically told him the story and what we wanted to do. And the very next week, we had a show right on Channel 5, going right up, heads up against the Channel 13 show. And if my memory serves me right, I think the Channel 13 show, which Nick said that we wouldn't last 2 weeks, I think the Channel 13 show lasted about 2 weeks, and it was off the air. And so then we were there, and of course, basically without TV in Memphis, Nick knew he didn't have a chance. He looked around the other stations, couldn't get a show on. And so to show you how powerful the show was at that time, Channel 13, when it had the wrestling show, had the highest rated program in Memphis, and the wrestling show had the highest rated news at 5 o'clock and 10 o'clock because Dave Brown was the weatherman, and he was also the co-host of the wrestling show, and just Dave's personality was so strong that it made their news number one. And Lance Russell was the program director at Channel 13. And so all of these guys, they had the big show, and they had two great personalities. And like I said, after 2 weeks, that show went off the air, and we wound up bringing Dave Brown to Channel 5 and put their news immediately in number one at 5 and 10 o'clock. And we also brought Lance Russell. He quit his job as a program director at Channel 13 and came with us and came to work for Jerry and I at the wrestling organization, and of course co-hosted this show on Channel 5.
TitleMatchNetwork.com